Again, in Sheikh Jarrah, we were staying with four families of Palestinian refugees who had been what I would call forcibly evicted from their homes by the Israeli government, both the municipality of Jerusalem and the federal Israeli government. A far right-wing Israeli settler organization had commandeered the homes and had started moving their own people into the homes. And so there was a very, very tense situation in this neighborhood where you had Palestinian refugees living in tents outside of their former homes. These are people who have now been displaced not once but twice, because these are refugees from 48, and they were living in protest tents outside of their home. Now, there was a heavy police presence on the streets. The Israeli occupation forces claimed it was to protect both the Israeli settlers and the Palestinians, but what we saw was a large amount of harassment and sometimes physical violence by the Israeli settlers against the Palestinian refugees who were maintaining a peaceful presence outside of their homes that they had a legal right to occupy. Settlers would come in late at night, large groups of men would come in with dogs and just walk the streets and kind of have an intimidating presence. A lot of times they would attack the houses with rocks and bricks. Sometimes they would physically assault even young Palestinian children in the streets. There was frequent clashes that often escalated. So my job at that time was primarily to stand guard at night while people slept and just kind of keep my eye out. A lot of times nothing happened. A lot of times I sat there all night in front of a campfire and drank tea and just talked with some of the Palestinians there, but other times you'd have to kind of get in the middle of a crowd of settlers and a crowd of Palestinians and try to keep the violence as low as possible. I spent the last 3 weeks of December 2009 with the International Solidarity Movement. That's a movement, a Palestinian-led movement that uses direct action and creative nonviolence and protective accompaniment to strengthen and support the Palestinian resistance. Well, we did 2 days of nonviolent direct action training when I first got there. That mostly focused on cultural training, de-escalation techniques, ways to de-escalate violent situations, and weapons training, so that we knew how to react in potentially violent situations or where the Israeli occupation forces were deploying less than lethal or live ammunition. From what I understand, 3 Palestinians and a number of international activists formed the organization in 2001, and it's been active throughout the area since 2001. Okay. In the summertime, they have sometimes up to 100, 150, 200 volunteers from all over the world in there. When I was there, we had less than 10 people. It was kind of a slow time for volunteers, but it was actually very important that there were people there because it was such a low time. I mean, the ISM is spread out all across the country. They have offices in Nablus, East Jerusalem, Ramallah, sometimes Hebron, sometimes throughout the villages like Belaim and Nailin. During the harvest, they accompany farmers out to their lands so that they can harvest their crops with some degree of protection. When I was there, we were primarily focused in East Jerusalem and outside Nablus, as well as in Belaim and Nailin. There's a burgeoning, kind of a fledgling nonviolent resistance movement among the Palestinians. It's a coalition of Palestinian activists, left-wing Israelis, such as Rabbis for Human Rights, the Anarchists Against the Wall, Peace Now, which is an older kind of 60s radical peace organization, and then international solidarity activists, from the United States, from Europe, Australia, things like that. That was one of the most fortunate parts of my experience, actually, was to be able to work with Israeli peace activists. I spent a lot of time in the East Jerusalem neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah. Sheikh Jarrah was founded, in 1954, the United Nations and the Jordanian government settled refugees from the 48 war, Palestinian refugees, into this East Jerusalem neighborhood. They built them homes, provided housing assistance, and the families have lived in that neighborhood ever since. Now, in the 1967 war, Israel occupied East Jerusalem. The international community considers East Jerusalem to be part of a future Palestinian state. The Palestinians consider East Jerusalem to be their future capital. Israel says that all of Jerusalem is theirs. So East Jerusalem's occupied by the Israeli occupation forces, and there's a large conflict going on over the territory there. What the Israeli government has done over the years is to slowly but surely evict Palestinians out of the neighborhoods and resettle them with Israeli citizens, so that they can slowly but surely change the demographics and change the kind of the highway infrastructure to cut off East Jerusalem from the rest of the West Bank. Our most potent weapon was a video camera, because the video camera, the fact that there was outside eyes there, the fact that they were being filmed, that would automatically have a de-escalating presence on the situation. It would bring down the level of intensity. Because the outside world could see, it's the Peace Brigades International calls it the grandma effect, because there's some things you won't do if you know your grandma is watching. And so if the eyes of the international community are shining a spotlight onto a situation, there's less of a chance for human rights violations, because the perpetrators will hesitate before they pull the trigger, because of that outside presence, because of that grandma effect. There's a myth of balance and objectivity in the mainstream media accounts of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. There's a myth that it's two equal sides with two equal armies that are both fighting and committing violence. Now, it is true that human rights violations have occurred on both sides, but what I think is really important to stress is that there's an extreme imbalance of power. The power dynamics in the conflict are extremely one-sided and extremely unbalanced. You know, Israel has one of the largest militaries in the world. They have a first world economy that's globally integrated into the economic system. They have the full financial and diplomatic support of the United States. Palestine is a nation of people without a state. And so until that underlying power dynamic changes, there's very little incentive for Israel to give up its settlement blocks in the West Bank. It's spent the last, at least since '67, annexing territory from the West Bank. They put up the apartheid wall, kilometers past the Green Line, and annex all the territory back to Israel. There's very little incentive for them to give any kind of serious concessions necessary for a two-state solution, unless the fundamental power dynamics in the situation changes. And the Palestinians that I worked with were very aware of that situation. They had organized, a nonviolent, popular resistance movement to challenge the apartheid wall, to challenge the illegal settlements, to challenge both the Israeli government and the far right-wing paramilitary factions in the country. But they can use our help. And one of the ways that American civil society, one of the ways American peace movement can help is, of course, there's the obvious things like writing newspaper accounts, letters to the editor, organizing rallies and demonstrations, educational events. But I think the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement is an international movement that's picked up a lot of steam, especially since the shelling of Gaza last year. And it's a way that we can challenge the economic. If we can put economic pressure on Israel by sanctioning them, by boycotting them, we can have the same effect that we had in the apartheid conflict in South Africa, where American citizens divested their investments in South Africa, in companies that did business in apartheid South Africa, and they were able to leverage an extreme amount of power out of that situation, and that forced South Africa to give up some of its claims. And that's an example of something that we can do to change the conflict. Again, it's a nonviolent tactic. It's a popular tactic. It's one that has a proven track record of success. There's a precedent for it in South Africa, and it's something that people can do back here at home.